You're listening to The New Paris. I'm your host, Lindsay Tremuta. There's no guest for today's episode. I know it's been a while since I've done one of these monologues, but I wanted to talk about a topic I was recently asked to write about for Elle magazine in France, and that's the subject of tipping and tip culture. Given that tourism across France is back in a big way, and the French themselves are back to traveling beyond their borders, the question of if and how much to tip has resurfaced. And because my story was in French, I had a few requests to discuss the theme in English. So here we go. Let me preface this by saying it was a particularly timely and fresh in mind subject of debate for me to write about because I was recently in the US. I am no stranger to American tip culture, but it felt especially jarring on this last trip. Sure, due to an ongoing supply chain issue and the start of greater inflation at that time, I noticed that products and services simply cost more. But that doesn't fully explain why I wager I must have spent between 50 to 60% more on average for meals, services, and experiences than I ever do in France. For the record, I was in New York City and the Philadelphia suburbs. Overall, after living in France for 16 years, the sticker shock at every turn was simply overwhelming. So at the end of each meal, the way things would go, whenever I was eating outside of the home, my dining companions and I would dig into our wallets, fiddle with our smartphone calculators, and then decide how much money to give our server or bartender for a job well done. Now, even before COVID, any less than 20% on the bill before tax in the US was considered insulting. As a kid, I remember it was much lower than that, but over time, this has climbed to 20%. After a massive push to show solidarity for restaurant and service workers throughout COVID, some people even edged that up to 25%. And according to who you ask, that may one day become the new standard. Of course, by the end of my first week in the US, I was ready to forego dining out entirely. A separate topic we can discuss at some point would be the value, the quality of the food you're getting for the money spent, but again, I'll leave that for another day. So the question is, why does this system exist, and how should you navigate the same issue of tipping in France? Well, first, let's begin with one thing. It's easy to assume that tip culture was born in the US, but in fact, that's not entirely true. Historically, it's believed that wealthy Americans on luxurious voyages to Europe in the years leading up to the Civil War brought back the custom of tipping. It is thought to have originated actually in the 17th century in England, in English taverns where customers would slip a little extra money to the waiter to ensure prompt service. In the late 1800s, following the Civil War, there was a movement against tipping in the US as many Americans believed that tipping went against the country's ideals and allowed a clear servile class that would be financially dependent on a higher class. There were even failed attempts to pass anti-tipping bills that would have deemed the practice unlawful. Of course, we know how things shifted after that, and without a legal framework to ban gratuities, employers hiring recently emancipated slaves and also immigrants in hospitality or on the railroad took that to mean that they could pay them next to nothing, forcing them to rely on gratuities for the majority of their pay. From there, the practice, anchored in exploitation, proliferated. Even today, as some reports indicate, tipped workers of color continue to suffer the consequences of this legacy. In the restaurant industry alone, over 27% of Black workers live in poverty. About 37% of tipped workers are mothers, and nearly half of these women are single mothers. One last bit that's crucial to understand and which most foreigners don't realize is that in the US, there are minimum wages for hourly workers, which could range from $7.25, which is the federal minimum wage, to $15 an hour in cities like New York. But there are federal and state laws that allow employers to pay workers who receive tips far less than the minimum wage. That's called the federal subminimum tipped wage, and it has been stuck at $2.13 per hour since 1991. So when you're dining out, you're essentially paying the salary that the employer should actually be paying the worker. Some restaurant industry leaders like Danny Myers, whose group is behind the Gramercy Tavern and the fast casual chain Shake Shack, have tried to end tipping policies. Myers actually pioneered the idea in 2015, but reinstated them in the summer of 2020, citing slashed revenues from the pandemic. You can read more about that at the link I shared in the show notes of this episode. So the US context is very particular. In France, aside from the majority of delivery workers, service workers earn a salary. It may be minimum wage, which is currently a gross rate of €10.85 or more, according to an establishment's ability to offer higher wages. Some 20 to 30 years ago, tipping was more common in France and represented a 13th or 14th month of earnings. But over time, the mentality has shifted. First, there's the belief that due to the social and fiscal system in France, which also allows for a certain level of labor protection that Americans simply do not have, tipping seems like an unnecessary bonus. Also, French people have grown accustomed to consuming more cheaply. If you look at the development of big box supermarkets and fast food chains that have dominated the French landscape for the last 20 to 30 years, they struggle to see the value in paying for service on top of the food or beverage itself. A more modern issue is also that the French pay more and more by card. 1 out of 2 transactions in France is actually paid by credit card or debit card, leading to empty change purses. If you pay by card, you may not have the same kind of spare change on you that you used to when you were paying everything by cash. The US has mostly adjusted for this reality by allowing customers to add tip on their credit card payment, but that has yet to take off in France. So what's the suggestion? And what's the rule in France versus elsewhere in and around Europe? I hate to say it, but there's really no absolute truth here. Leaving a little tip is still considered a bonus for great service in most European countries, as opposed to an integral part of someone's livelihood. Tips are certainly widespread and widely appreciated, particularly in Italy, Spain, and Germany, where they are more expected than even in Belgium or France. The exception is perhaps in Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Iceland, where service charges are built into prices and employee wages. What you can do if you'd like is round up to the nearest euro when you pay for services, but beyond that, it isn't compulsory to add extra in restaurants or hotels. However, in Iceland, no professions are tipped as a matter of course. So should you leave a little something in France? Yeah. And maybe you want to leave a little more than the French, who on average hover at 5% tip, making them the worst tippers in Europe. Here, if you're not sure how much to leave, you can go with the 10% rule. In most places, that's considered fair and even generous and won't offend. In taxis, you can round up to the nearest euro, and you can offer a little something extra to your hairdresser here too. With less purchasing power, not everyone can give the tip they'd like. But if you can, in restaurants, think of it this way. 1 or 2 euros extra in a cafe if the service was solid, 5 euros give or take if the service was exceptional. Resist the temptation to leave 1-cent pieces if the service was awful. I know you think that might be sending a message, but it's just better to leave nothing at all. And in fine dining restaurants where you may already be emptying your wallet or your life savings, 5 to 10% is plenty generous if, of course, you feel you want to leave something extra. As I said, there is no hard and fast rule, so go with your instincts. I hope this helps as you're potentially traveling through France and clarifies a bit of the complicated and problematic origins of tipping to begin with. If you're in France and read French, I'll also be in this week's issue of Elle talking about the problem of no-shows in restaurants and how a group of around 100 chefs and industry workers are standing up to put a stop to bad behavior. I'll be back soon enough with new episodes. Until then, you can find me online, or if I'm doing this whole boundary setting thing properly, maybe you won't. Either way, thanks as always for listening, and à bientôt. That's the show for today. As always, thank you for listening, subscribing, and sharing with friends. You can find all previous episodes of the New Paris podcast wherever you stream your podcasts and on World Radio Paris. If you're enjoying these conversations, please consider picking up a copy of the New Paris book or my recent release, The New Parisienne, from your local booksellers. Until next time, à bientôt.